Well, the number of people in the world forcibly displaced has reached its highest level on record. That's the finding by the United Nations peak refugee body in its annual report. The UNHCR found as of the end of last year, 82.4 million people were forcibly displaced worldwide, 48 million within their own country, the remainder displaced abroad, most as refugees. And aid agencies say the numbers would be even higher if COVID hadn't shut down international borders.
They're the world's most vulnerable people, their lives upended by events out of their control. War, persecution, natural disaster. And their numbers worldwide are growing dramatically.
Sadly, we're seeing record numbers of global displacement. We've seen over the last decade the number of forcibly displaced people worldwide double.
Over the past decade, civil war has raged on in Syria, resulting in 13.5 million displacements, the worst affected country in the world. Venezuela's long-running refugee crisis accounts for 4 million of those displaced today. Among other crises highlighted by the UNHCR's Global Trends report, the persecution of Myanmar's Rohingya Muslim minority. 1 million remain in overcrowded camps in neighbouring Bangladesh. While in Africa, ethnic conflict is still widespread. Violence in Ethiopia displaced 1 million people in 2020 alone, while 500,000 fled abduction and massacre in Mozambique. Those displacements just a small sample of a growing global problem.
Conflict is, I guess, the greatest factor forcing people from their homes. But now we're seeing much more complex situations where climate change, urbanisation, poverty, food security are all coming together to really be, I guess you might say, a megastorm where we're seeing these very large numbers of people leaving.
And in the past year, the COVID pandemic has exacerbated and complicated.
You already had communities that were under pressure. You then have COVID. You then put on top of that the isolation and the restriction of economic activity. You have food insecurity and food shortages. And you're going to see an increased number of people moving, which will add and compound and increase conflict.
According to the UNHCR, closed borders have reduced the number of forcibly displaced people seeking refuge overseas by an estimated 1.5 million. Those people now stuck in unsafe situations. For those already in refugee camps, the pandemic took a toll on people's finances and mental health, while gender and sexual-based violence increased. School closures, just one example of how already precarious existences became even harder.
We have had increase in the number of teenage pregnancy cases in the village. That is so common since schools have closed down. Children are not going to school, children are idle and they're moving around doing nothing.
And it's children who remain of major concern when it comes to dealing with the world's displaced. Not only are they more vulnerable, but they also make up a disproportionate amount of those forced to flee. They constitute 30% of the world's population, but 42% of those who are displaced. Since 2018, 1 million babies have started life as refugees. At the Bidi Bidi camp in Uganda.
Hi, I'm called Harriet. I'm 17 years old.
These South Sudanese teenagers, some separated from their parents, documented a day in their lives for SBS World News. Speaking of struggles,
you need to buy for yourself a clothes, but there's no way you can get money. You want to buy for yourself a food, but no way.
But also their dreams.
I want to become a teacher. When I grow, I want to help my parents, I want to help my elders, and I want to help the people.
These children and those entrusted to protect them holding on to glimmers of hope, like the fact that 3.5 million displaced people were safely able to return home last year, although far fewer, less than 35,000, were resettled in new countries, the lowest number in 2 decades. Omar Dehen, SBS World News.
Today is World Refugee Day, drawing attention to the plight of those forced to flee their homes due to war, persecution and poverty. Aid workers in some of the world's most dire regions for displacement say they're desperate for more support to deal with surging numbers. They're warning many conflicts still are not getting the public attention needed to shore up critical response efforts.
In a shanty town in northern Peru, a young family with little more than each other is settling into a new life. It's modest, but for Charlize, her husband Jose, and their 3 children, who trekked 2,000 kilometers to get here, it far exceeds the extreme poverty they left behind.
Salimos de Venezuela para conseguir un buen futuro. No, ya se sienten un poco mejor que allá en Venezuela, por la situación que había mucha delincuencia, mucha inseguridad, mucha hambre.
Gracias a Dios me he sentido ya más tranquila, más estable, más segura en las condiciones.
The situation in Venezuela has been deteriorating for 2 decades, but its political, social and financial problems have worsened significantly under current President Nicolas Maduro.
I think it's a really dire situation for Venezuelans. There are almost 3.9 million Venezuelans right now living outside their country and abroad.
Since 2014, there's been an 8,000% increase in the number of Venezuelans seeking refugee status. The crisis inside the country has, on occasion, grabbed global headlines. But aid groups say it's one of many regions where the scale of displacement is often overlooked. It's a problem known all too well in Africa. Fresh unrest in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Central African Republic already seeing large numbers of people displaced. It's of major concern to already overwhelmed aid groups in a region where conflicts are numerous.
We've had conflict that has raged on in various parts of the region, in Sudan, in South Sudan, and now in Tigray region of Ethiopia, which have pushed significant numbers of people into very challenging circumstances.
Joseph Kamara is the head of World Vision's humanitarian and emergency efforts in East Africa.
At the moment, we are very desperate. We are desperate because help is not sufficient. What are we going to do with the refugees? How do we prevent more deaths? How do we prevent malnutrition?
In the Middle East, World Vision fears another famine is imminent in Afghanistan. Another refugee crisis also predicted, as the Taliban increases its deadly push for more control and American troops begin to leave.
I'm concerned that we will see, in the current situation of Afghanistan, without continuing support of the global community to security and to development, that again we'll see a very large exodus out of that country.
The number of refugees from Afghanistan is currently the 3rd highest in the world, behind Syria and Venezuela. South Sudan and Myanmar round out the top 5. Bharat Ali Batur was a photojournalist in Afghanistan until he fled political and religious persecution. He's been in Australia since 2013 and believes another civil war is brewing in his home country.
I feel devastated because since I left, every day, the security situation only got worse, and I'm not really hopeful about the future as well.
Bharat is now married and has a young son named Aslan. He is grateful for his family's prospects in Melbourne, but hopes world powers continue to support Afghanistan, despite the pending closure of foreign embassies like Australia's.
It is only the civilians and the people of Afghanistan who are paying the price, and they are the ones who will be paying even more.
Bharat is now a refugee support worker, helping others who've also escaped history's darkest chapters, generating public understanding in their new lives for the homes and people they left behind. Omar Dehen, SBS World News.
One of Australia's largest refugee resettlement agencies is suffering major cutbacks to staff and funding as intake numbers dwindle due to international border closures. There are now warnings that by the time refugees are again allowed to enter the country, capacity to support them will be insufficient.
It's been 13 years since Paskazi Mudewe arrived in Australia from war-torn Congo. The mother of 3 now has her sons Samuel, Emmanuel and Canel. But back in 2008, it was a different story.
When I came to Australia, I came alone. I didn't know anyone. It is very important to help people who are new in the country because first for themselves, they really need that help to know the system, to get used to the system of the country.
Paskazi is thankful for the support she's received, helping her learn the language and eventually find a job as a migrant caseworker. She's just one beneficiary of such services for new arrivals. There are a variety of settlement groups in Australia, some federally or state-funded, others not-for-profit or private. They focus on things like accommodation, helping people connect to their communities, education, language, employment and health. But COVID has had far-reaching impacts.
It's been a seismic shift. We've seen every element of the organisation, from the top to the bottom, change.
Settlement Services International is the largest not-for-profit humanitarian settlement organisation in Australia. It employs many migrants and refugees, and the majority of its funding comes from state and federal governments. Despite the COVID challenges, it managed to adapt some face-to-face services to online. But with the refugee intake paused, staff from its humanitarian settlement team are under pressure.
It's devastating. We're now embarking on, redundancies. By the time this process finishes in the next few months, we will be a third capacity. There's contracts, for example, the refugee resettlement program is fee for service. If clients don't come, you don't receive any fees.
SSI and fellow organisation AIMS account for roughly 2/3 of resettlement services in Australia. In a non-COVID year, AIMS Australia supports 4,000 new refugees in Victoria. It hasn't yet been forced into redundancies, but has used this time to bolster its other services.
We've had to pivot to supporting the caseload that we've already got here to help them understand the critical information about the pandemic. And we've had some success in getting refugees into jobs, which has assuaged their fears about the future.
6,000 people were granted humanitarian visas last year and are still waiting to enter the country. But when they'll be able to do so is unclear. Settlement agencies are making preparations for next year and are anticipating by then more than 20,000 people will be in the queue.
We have some capacity, we have equity, we have some reserves. However, many smaller do not, and they are really struggling. And once you lose that, it's very hard to get it back.
A loss that would be felt by people like Winter Eob. She and her sister Sophie were barely teenagers when they fled religious persecution in Eritrea. They're both in their final semesters at universities in Melbourne and have gained employment in their sectors. But they're passionate about giving back to others like them.
Especially migrants, newcomers, not just my community but anyone who have had a refugee experience or a difficult background, to help them realize their potential and see there are a lot of opportunities here in Australia, not just be limited to their background.
Limitations that could be exacerbated if the capacity of the essential services around them are cut. Omar Dehen, SBS World News.